The autumn leaves danced outside the grand windows of Ashford Manor, as Elena Catherine stood in the library, her fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound book she had read countless times. The weight of the decision she and her husband Alexander had made together pressed heavily on her heart. After 12 years of marriage and 3 beautiful children, they had reached a crossroads that neither had ever imagined they would face. Alexander William Ashford had always been a man of duty. Born into one of England's most prominent families, he carried the expectations of generations on his shoulders. His grandfather had been a respected diplomat, his father a successful businessman who expanded their family's influence across Europe. Now at 38, Alexander found himself torn between the life he had built with Elena and the responsibilities that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. Their love story had begun like a fairy tale. They met at a charity gala in London when Elena was just 24, a brilliant art curator with dreams of opening her own gallery. Alexander, then 26 and fresh from completing his studies at Oxford, was immediately captivated by her intelligence and grace. She wasn't from his world of inherited wealth and social obligations, but that's exactly what drew him to her. Elena brought authenticity to his life in a way that nothing else ever had. The early years of their marriage were filled with joy and possibility. They traveled together, with Elena helping Alexander understand art and culture in ways his privileged upbringing had never allowed. He supported her dreams, using his connections to help her establish herself in London's competitive art world. Their first child, young William, arrived 2 years after their wedding, followed by Charlotte and then little James. Their home became a sanctuary where love and laughter echoed through every room. But as Alexander's family business grew more complex and demanding, the cracks in their perfect life began to show. The phone calls came at all hours, business trips stretched longer, and family dinners were interrupted by urgent matters that couldn't wait. Elena found herself raising their children more and more alone, while Alexander disappeared into a world of board meetings, international contracts, and social obligations that she couldn't fully understand or be part of. The breaking point came 6 months ago during what should have been a celebration. Alexander's company had just secured the largest contract in its history, a deal that would provide security for their family for generations. Instead of joy, Elena felt only a deep sadness as she watched her husband shake hands with investors and smile for photographers, knowing that this success meant he would be pulled even further away from their family. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together in their bedroom and had the most honest conversation of their marriage. Alexander spoke about the pressure he felt to live up to his family's legacy, how every decision he made affected not just them, but dozens of employees and their families. Elena shared her loneliness, her fear that their children were growing up without really knowing their father, and her own dreams that had been put on hold for so long, she wasn't sure she remembered what they were. They cried together that night, holding each other as they acknowledged what they both knew, but had been afraid to say out loud. Their love hadn't died, but the life they had built together was slowly suffocating it. Alexander's world demanded everything from him, and Elena's soul was withering in the shadow of obligations that weren't her own. The decision to separate wasn't made in anger or resentment, but in a kind of desperate love that wanted to preserve what was good between them before it was completely lost. They would remain devoted co-parents to their children, but they would step back from their marriage to give each other the space to rediscover who they were as individuals. As Elena stood in the library that October afternoon, she could hear Alexander upstairs helping little James pack his favorite toys. Tomorrow, Alexander would move to the London apartment they had purchased years ago, but rarely used. The children would split their time between both homes, and they would all learn to navigate this new reality together. The hardest part wasn't the logistics or even explaining to their friends and family. The hardest part was knowing that they still loved each other deeply, but that sometimes love meant letting go. Elena pressed her hand against the window, watching the leaves fall, and whispered a prayer that they were making the right choice for everyone involved, especially their precious children who deserved parents who were whole and happy, even if those parents couldn't be whole and happy together. The morning of Alexander's departure arrived with an unusual quiet that seemed to settle over Ashford Manor, like a heavy blanket. Elena woke before dawn, unable to sleep, and found herself in the kitchen making breakfast for her family one last time as they had always known it. The familiar routine of preparing Alexander's coffee exactly how he liked it, dark with just a touch of cream, felt both comforting and heartbreaking. Alexander appeared in the doorway at 7 sharp, dressed in his usual business attire but carrying a sadness in his eyes that Elena had never seen before. They moved around each other in the kitchen with the practiced ease of 12 years together, but every gesture felt weighted with significance. When their hands accidentally touched reaching for the same cabinet, they both paused, looking at each other with a mixture of love and loss that words couldn't express. The children came downstairs one by one, sensing that something important was happening, even though Alexander and Elena had carefully explained the situation to them over the past weeks. 10-year-old William, who had inherited his father's serious nature, helped his younger siblings with their breakfast without being asked. 8-year-old Charlotte kept glancing between her parents with worried eyes, while 5-year-old James simply enjoyed having both his parents home at the same time, unaware that this would be their last morning together as a traditional family. After breakfast, Alexander gathered the children in the sitting room for a final conversation. He knelt down to their level and spoke with the gentle honesty that Elena had always admired about him. He reminded them that both their parents loved them more than anything in the world, and that love would never change, regardless of where anyone lived. He promised that he would still be at every school play, every football match, and every bedtime story when they were at his apartment in London. William, trying to be brave like his father, nodded seriously and asked if this meant he would get to see more of London now. Charlotte burst into tears and threw her arms around Alexander's neck, making him promise over and over that he would come back to visit them at the manor. Little James, still not fully understanding, asked if Daddy would be home for dinner tomorrow, and Alexander had to take a moment to compose himself before explaining once again about their new arrangement. Elena watched from the doorway, her heart breaking and mending simultaneously as she saw Alexander's devotion to their children. This was why their decision had been so difficult and yet so necessary. They both wanted to be the best parents possible, and they had realized that staying in an increasingly strained marriage might prevent that from happening. The actual moment of departure was surprisingly simple. Alexander loaded his suitcases into his car while Elena stood on the front steps of their home, the same steps where they had posed for pictures on their wedding day 12 years ago. The children gathered around her, and they all waved as Alexander pulled away down the long driveway lined with oak trees that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. As the car disappeared around the bend, Charlotte asked if they could call Daddy when he got to London. Elena assured her that they could, and that this wasn't goodbye forever, just the beginning of a different kind of family. She gathered her children close and suggested they spend the day doing something special together. Perhaps visiting the art museum in town that she had been meaning to take them to for months. That afternoon, as they walked through the museum's galleries, Elena found herself seeing the paintings with fresh eyes. She had forgotten how much joy art brought her, how it made her feel connected to something larger than her daily worries and responsibilities. Charlotte was fascinated by the portraits, asking questions about the people in the paintings and what their lives might have been like. William studied the technical aspects of the brushwork, with the same analytical mind he had inherited from Alexander. Even little James was engaged, making up stories about the scenes depicted in the landscapes. For the first time in months, Elena felt a spark of excitement about the future. She realized that this separation, as painful as it was, might give her the chance to rediscover parts of herself that had been dormant for too long. She thought about the gallery she had once dreamed of opening, the art classes she could take, the friendships she could nurture without constantly worrying about conflicting schedules and obligations. That evening, after the children were asleep, Elena sat in the library with a cup of tea and allowed herself to cry. She cried for the marriage that hadn't worked out as they had hoped, for the pain their children would have to navigate, and for the uncertainty that lay ahead. But she also cried tears of relief, knowing that she and Alexander had chosen courage over comfort, honesty over pretense. When her phone rang at 9 o'clock, she saw Alexander's name on the screen. His voice was quiet when she answered, and she could picture him in the London apartment, probably standing by the window looking out at the city lights. He told her that the children's rooms were ready for their first visit that weekend, and that he had already missed them terribly in just the few hours since he left. They talked for nearly an hour about practical matters and shared memories. And Elena realized that perhaps this was what their relationship needed to become. Two people who had loved deeply, who shared the most important thing in the world in their children, and who could support each other, even if they couldn't be married anymore. 3 weeks into their new arrangement, Elena discovered that the hardest moments weren't the obvious ones like holidays or anniversaries, but the small, unexpected times when she would automatically reach for her phone to share something funny James had said, only to remember that Alexander was no longer part of her daily routine. The house felt different without his presence, quieter in some ways but also somehow more spacious, as if she could breathe more deeply in the rooms that had once felt cramped with unspoken tension. The children were adjusting better than she had dared to hope. Their first weekend at Alexander's London apartment had been an adventure that they talked about for days afterward. He had taken them to museums and parks, shown them parts of the city they had never seen, and most importantly, had been fully present with them in a way that Elena realized he hadn't been in months. When he was trying to balance family time with work, pressures, Elena had used that first weekend alone to do something she hadn't done in years. Absolutely nothing that anyone else needed. She slept late, took long baths, read an entire novel in one sitting, and walked through her garden at sunset without checking her phone once. The silence felt foreign at first, but gradually it became peaceful rather than lonely. When the children returned on Sunday evening, they were full of stories about their father's apartment, the tall buildings they could see from the windows, and the funny way Alexander had tried to make pancakes and accidentally used salt instead of sugar. Elena found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks, realizing how much she had missed hearing about Alexander's minor domestic disasters. At work, Elena had quietly begun exploring opportunities she had put aside years ago. Her position at the small gallery in town had been comfortable and safe, but it hadn't challenged her in years. She reached out to contacts in London's art world, people she had known before marriage, and children had shifted her priorities. To her surprise, several gallery owners remembered her work and were interested in discussing possibilities. One afternoon, while the children were at school, Elena received a call that would change everything. Margaret Richardson, who owned one of London's most respected contemporary art galleries, had an immediate opening for a senior curator. The position would require Elena to split her time between London and local artist studios, traveling to exhibitions and working with collectors. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about 15 years ago. The practical complications were overwhelming. The job would mean being away from the children more often, coordinating schedules with Alexander, possibly selling the manor that had been their family home. But as Elena walked through her empty house that afternoon, she realized that holding on to their old life out of fear wasn't protecting anyone, least of all her children. That evening, she called Alexander to discuss the opportunity. She had expected him to worry about the logistics, to question whether it was the right time for such a big change. Instead, his first words were congratulations, followed by genuine excitement about her chance to return to the career she had loved. They talked for over 2 hours, working through potential solutions to the scheduling challenges, discussing how they could maintain stability for the children while both pursuing the lives they needed to live. Alexander surprised her by suggesting that perhaps it was time to sell the manor anyway. The house had become a symbol of obligations and expectations that no longer served their family's needs. They could find something smaller, more manageable, closer to London where both their work would be centered. The children could have bedrooms in both places, and everyone would be starting fresh together. 3 days later, Elena accepted the position at Richardson Gallery. The children received the news with the adaptability that never ceased to amaze her. William was excited about the possibility of living closer to his father and the museums he had discovered. Charlotte was interested in the idea of helping Elena pick out art for exhibitions. Even little James seemed to understand that Mommy would be happier if she could do the work that made her smile. Elena's first day at the gallery felt like coming home to herself. She spent the morning reviewing submissions for an upcoming exhibition featuring emerging British artists, feeling her mind engage with creative challenges in ways it hadn't for years. Margaret Richardson was impressed by Elena's insights and suggestions, and by lunchtime Elena knew she had made the right decision. During her lunch break, She walked through Covent Garden and found herself in front of the building, where she and Alexander had had their first official date 13 years ago. The restaurant was still there, though under different ownership, and Elena could almost see their younger selves sitting by the window, talking animatedly about art and books and all the places they wanted to travel together. Standing there on the busy London street, Elena felt an unexpected sense of peace about their journey. They had loved each other well for many years, had created 3 extraordinary children, and had built memories that would always be precious. The fact that their marriage hadn't lasted forever didn't diminish the value of what they had shared. That evening, when she called to tell Alexander about her first day, she could hear the genuine happiness in his voice as she described the projects she would be working on. They talked about their plans to look at houses together the following weekend, about how to tell the children's schools about the upcoming changes, about all the practical details of creating a new kind of family. Before they hung up, Alexander said something that stayed with Elena for the rest of the evening. "I'm proud of us, you know, for choosing what was right instead of what was easy." Elena agreed, realizing that their quiet parting was becoming something else entirely, a quiet beginning of lives that honored both their love for each other and their need to become who they were meant to be. The spring air carried the scent of cherry blossoms as Elena stood in the courtyard of her new home, watching William teach Charlotte how to properly kick a football, while little James collected flower petals in a small basket. 6 months had passed since Alexander moved out of the manor, and their family had found a rhythm that surprised everyone with its harmony. The house they had chosen together was a Victorian terrace in Hampstead, close enough to London for Elena's work, but with a garden large enough for the children to play. Alexander had found a larger apartment just 10 minutes away, and the children moved between both homes with an ease that spoke to how carefully their parents had managed the transition. Elena's work at Richardson Gallery had exceeded her expectations. She had just finished curating her first major exhibition, a show featuring contemporary female artists that had received wonderful reviews in the art press. More importantly, she felt intellectually alive in ways she had forgotten were possible. The long conversations with artists about their creative processes, the challenge of designing exhibitions that would engage both critics and the public, the satisfaction of helping emerging talents find their audience. All of it reminded her why she had fallen in love with art in the first place. Alexander, too, seemed to be thriving in their new arrangement. Without the daily stress of trying to balance an increasingly demanding marriage with his work responsibilities, he had found ways to streamline his business commitments. He had promoted his most trusted colleague to handle many of the international contracts that had previously required his constant attention, allowing him to focus on the strategic aspects of the business that he actually enjoyed. More significantly, his relationship with the children had deepened in unexpected ways. When they stayed at his apartment, Alexander cooked dinner with them, helped with homework without distraction, and had established Saturday morning traditions like visiting Borough Market or taking long walks along the Thames. William had confided to Elena that he liked having his father's complete attention, something that had rarely happened when work calls interrupted every family activity. The challenge came from an unexpected source: other people's reactions to their unconventional arrangement. Friends and family struggled to understand how Elena and Alexander could be separated, but still speak daily, how they could attend school events together without animosity, how they could make major parenting decisions as a team while living apart. Elena's mother had been particularly vocal in her disapproval, arguing that Elena was giving up too easily on her marriage, that couples were supposed to work through difficulties together. Alexander's father had taken a different approach, suggesting that perhaps they were simply going through a phase and would reconcile once Elena's career experiment ran its course. The comment stung, particularly because Elena and Alexander both sometimes wondered if they were making the right choice. There were moments when their old partnership felt so natural that separation seemed absurd. When Charlotte broke her arm falling off her bicycle, Elena and Alexander had instinctively come together at the hospital, comforting their daughter and each other with the practiced teamwork of years. Watching other couples at school events sometimes made Elena wonder if they were throwing away something that could be repaired with enough effort. The clarity came during a conversation they had while walking through Hyde Park after William's football match. Alexander had scored the winning goal, and both parents were glowing with pride as they discussed their son's growing confidence on the field. As they walked, Elena found herself studying Alexander's profile, remembering all the reasons she had fallen in love with him. "Do you ever think we made a mistake?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her, considering her words carefully before responding. "I think about what our marriage was like before we separated," he said finally. "I remember how we barely talked to each other except about schedules and logistics. I remember how you looked at me sometimes like you were disappointed but too polite to say so. I remember feeling like I was failing everyone all the time." Elena nodded, recognizing the truth in his description. "And now? Now I look forward to our phone calls. I enjoy hearing about your work, and I think you actually listen when I talk about mine. Our children are happier because we're both happier. I don't think that's a mistake." They resumed walking, and Elena realized he was right. The friendship they had developed over the past months felt more genuine than their marriage had become in its final years. They supported each other's goals, celebrated each other's successes, and provided comfort during difficult moments, but without the resentment that had been building when they were trying to be something they couldn't sustain. That afternoon, Elena made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. She called her divorce lawyer and scheduled an appointment to begin the legal process of ending their marriage. It wasn't about anger or giving up hope. It was about acknowledging that their relationship had evolved into something different, something that deserved its own recognition rather than being measured against traditional marriage expectations. When she told Alexander about her decision that evening, he was quiet for a long moment before admitting that he had been thinking along the same lines. They agreed to tell the children together, to explain that divorcing didn't mean they loved each other less or that their family was broken, but that sometimes love meant accepting that people could be better for each other in different ways. The conversation with the children was emotional but honest. Charlotte cried and asked if this meant they would never live in the same house again. William wanted to understand the practical implications. Would holidays change? Would they still take family vacations together? James, still young enough to accept adult decisions without fully analyzing them, mainly wanted reassurance that both his parents would still be available when he needed them. That night, after the children were asleep, Elena sat in her garden and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete honesty about her life. She wasn't pretending to be happy in a marriage that wasn't working. She wasn't sacrificing her career ambitions for the sake of appearances. And she wasn't teaching her children that love meant staying in situations that diminished everyone involved. She was, instead, showing them that love could take many forms, that families could be strong even when they didn't fit traditional patterns, and that sometimes the most loving thing parents could do was choose their own happiness so they could be fully present for their children's lives. The courthouse was smaller than Elena had expected, with simple wooden benches and tall windows that let in the gray October light. She sat beside Alexander, both of them dressed formally but without the celebration that had marked their wedding day 14 years earlier. This time there were no flowers, no family members, no photographer capturing moments for posterity. Just two people who had loved each other well, quietly ending one chapter of their story so they could write new ones separately. The legal proceedings took less than an hour. Their solicitor had prepared all the paperwork months in advance, and since Elena and Alexander had agreed on everything from custody arrangements to property division, there were no disputes for the judge to resolve. They had divided their assets fairly, with Elena keeping the art collection they had built together, and Alexander retaining the larger financial investments. The Hampstead house would belong to Elena, while Alexander kept the London apartment and agreed to purchase a larger property where the children would have their own rooms. When the judge pronounced their marriage officially dissolved, Elena felt an unexpected mixture of sadness and relief. The sadness was for their younger selves who had stood at an altar making promises they genuinely believed would last forever. The relief was for the recognition that they had chosen the difficult path of honesty over the easier road of pretending their problems didn't exist. Outside the courthouse, Alexander offered to drive Elena home, but she declined, preferring to walk through London and process what had just happened. They hugged goodbye with the same warmth they had shared throughout their separation, and Alexander promised to pick up the children from school as planned, so Elena could have the afternoon to herself. As Elena walked through the city, she found herself thinking about the conversation she had with Charlotte the night before. Her 8-year-old daughter had asked, with the directness that children possess, whether the divorce meant that Elena and Alexander had never really loved each other. Elena had taken Charlotte's hands and explained that love wasn't always enough to make a marriage work, but that it was always enough to make a family work, even when that family looked different from what other people expected. The explanation had seemed to satisfy Charlotte, who had then asked if this meant she could have 2 birthday parties every year, one at each parent's house. Elena had laughed, realizing that children often found practical advantages in situations that adults viewed as purely problematic. Elena's phone rang as she passed through Covent Garden, and she smiled when she saw the caller ID. Margaret Richardson from the gallery had become not just her employer, but a mentor and friend, someone who understood the challenges of balancing ambitious career goals with family responsibilities. Margaret was calling with news that made Elena stop walking in amazement. The exhibition Elena had curated 6 months earlier had been so successful that she was being offered an opportunity to organize a traveling show that would visit galleries across Europe. It would mean extensive travel over the next year, working with international artists and curators, and establishing Elena as a significant voice in the contemporary art world. A year ago, such an opportunity would have been impossible to accept. Elena would have felt guilty about leaving the children, worried about disrupting family routines, concerned about adding stress to an already strained marriage. Now, with Alexander as a fully engaged co-parent and the children thriving in their 2-home arrangement, Elena could say yes to the kind of professional challenge she had dreamed about for 15 years. That evening, Elena cooked dinner for herself and the children in their Hampstead kitchen, listening to their chatter about school projects and weekend plans. William was working on a history presentation about medieval architecture. Charlotte was rehearsing for her school's autumn play, and James was simply happy to have his mother's attention as he built elaborate structures with his wooden blocks. When Alexander arrived to help with bedtime routines, as had become their custom on weeknights, Elena told him about Margaret's offer. His immediate response was enthusiasm for her opportunity, followed by practical questions about scheduling and logistics. They spent an hour after the children were asleep, working out how they could manage the travel requirements while maintaining stability for William, Charlotte, and James. The conversation was exactly the kind of partnership Elena had missed during the difficult final years of their marriage. Alexander offered to adjust his own schedule to accommodate her travel, suggested resources for childcare when both parents were unavailable, and asked thoughtful questions about Elena's long-term career goals. They were collaborating as co-parents and friends in ways they had never quite managed as husband and wife. As Alexander prepared to leave for his own home, Elena found herself studying his face in the hallway light. The stress lines that had appeared around his eyes during their marital troubles had softened, and he seemed more relaxed than she had seen him in years. She realized that their divorce had freed him as much as it had freed her, allowing him to be a better father and a more authentic person, without the constant pressure of trying to balance incompatible demands. "Thank you," she said suddenly, surprising them both. "For what?" Alexander asked. "For being brave enough to let us try this, for not insisting we stay married just because that's what was expected, for helping me remember who I wanted to be." Alexander smiled, the same gentle expression that had first attracted Elena to him all those years ago. "Thank you for the same reasons," he replied, "and for giving us the chance to love each other better, even if differently." After Alexander left, Elena sat in her living room with a cup of tea and Margaret's contract, reading through the details of the European exhibition project. For the first time since her early 20s, she was making a major life decision based entirely on what she wanted to do, what would challenge her intellectually and creatively, what would contribute to her field and her own growth. The woman who had stood at the altar 14 years ago, promising to love and honor and remain married until death, might not recognize the woman sitting in this Hampstead living room, preparing to sign a contract that would take her across Europe for months at a time. But Elena knew that both versions of herself were authentic, that people could change and grow while still honoring their most important commitments. Her commitment had never really been to staying married forever. It had been to loving Alexander and their children well. She was doing that now, just in a way that no one could have predicted when they first fell in love in that London art gallery so many years ago. 2 years after their quiet parting, Elena stood in the courtyard of a restored monastery in Tuscany, watching the morning light illuminate the medieval walls where contemporary sculptures would soon be displayed. Her European exhibition tour had exceeded every expectation, taking her to galleries in Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, and now Florence, where she was preparing to launch the final show of the series. The success of the exhibitions had established Elena as one of Europe's most respected curators of contemporary art. Art critics had praised her ability to create conversations between historical spaces and modern works, while emerging artists sought her attention for the career-changing opportunities her exhibitions provided. More importantly, Elena felt a deep satisfaction in work that challenged her intellectually while contributing something meaningful to the cultural world. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander, sent from London where he was attending William's school speech competition. Their 11-year-old son had inherited his father's gift for public speaking and his mother's artistic sensibility, creating presentations that were both informative and visually engaging. Alexander's message included a photo of William at the podium, looking confident and mature beyond his years. The coordination between Elena and Alexander had become so seamless that friends often marveled at how well they managed their unconventional co-parenting arrangement. When Elena was traveling for exhibitions, the children stayed with Alexander in his larger London home. When she was in England, they moved between both houses according to schedules they had all helped create. School events were attended by whichever parent was available, sometimes both, and holidays were planned collaboratively with the children's preferences taking priority over adult convenience. Charlotte, now 10, had developed a sophisticated understanding of art through her visits to Elena's exhibitions. She could discuss color theory and composition with the seriousness of someone twice her age, and had begun creating her own paintings that showed real talent. Alexander had set up a studio space in his home, where Charlotte could work on her art projects, supporting her interest even though he freely admitted that creativity was Elena's domain. 7-year-old James had adapted to their family structure with the flexibility that seemed to be his natural temperament. He made friends easily in both neighborhoods, treated both homes as equally his own, and had developed close relationships with both parents that were uncomplicated by the tension that had characterized Elena and Alexander's final years of marriage. The most unexpected development had been how Elena and Alexander's friendship had deepened through their divorce. Without the pressure of trying to maintain a romantic relationship that no longer served them, they had rediscovered the intellectual compatibility that had first brought them together. Their phone conversations often lasted for hours as they discussed the children's development, shared articles they thought the other would find interesting, and offered each other advice about professional challenges. Elena had been particularly grateful for Alexander's support 6 months earlier when she had been offered a permanent position as chief curator at a prestigious gallery in New York. The opportunity would have meant relocating permanently to America, taking her away from London and from the co-parenting arrangement that had worked so well for their family. After much consideration, Elena had declined the New York position, choosing instead to accept a newly created role as international curator for a consortium of European galleries. The position allowed her to continue traveling for exhibitions while maintaining her base in London, preserving the family stability that had become so important to all of them. Alexander had been the one to help her see that turning down New York didn't mean limiting her ambitions, but rather choosing ambitions that aligned with her values. "You built your career around the idea that art should serve communities," he had reminded her. "Your community is here now. Not just the children, but the network of artists and galleries you've developed relationships with. You can have international influence without abandoning the foundation you've built." Standing in the Tuscan courtyard, Elena received a call from Margaret Richardson with news that made her sit down abruptly on a stone bench. The Arts Council had awarded Elena a prestigious fellowship that would fund a year-long project documenting emerging artists across Eastern Europe. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about, combining travel, scholarship, and the chance to bring overlooked voices into mainstream art conversations. The fellowship would require extensive travel, but Elena immediately knew she wanted to accept. More importantly, she felt confident that she and Alexander could manage the logistics. just as they had navigated every other challenge their unconventional family arrangement had presented. That evening, Elena called Alexander from her hotel room in Florence to discuss the fellowship opportunity. As always, his first response was excitement for her professional success, followed by practical questions about timing and travel schedules. They spent nearly 2 hours working through the details, with Alexander offering to adjust his own business commitments to ensure the children's routines remained stable during Elena's research travels. During their conversation, Elena found herself thinking about how much their relationship had evolved since that difficult afternoon 2 years ago, when they had first acknowledged that their marriage wasn't working. They had created something entirely new together, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared commitment to their children's welfare, and genuine friendship that supported each other's individual growth. "Do you think we would have found our way to this if we had stayed married?" Elena asked during a pause in their planning discussion. Alexander was quiet for a moment before responding. "I don't think so. I think we were both trying so hard to be who we thought married people should be, that we lost track of who we actually were. This works because we can be ourselves completely." Elena agreed, realizing that their divorce had paradoxically brought them closer together than they had been in the final years of their marriage. They had learned to love each other as individuals rather than as roles, to support each other's dreams rather than feeling threatened by them, and to create a family structure that prioritized everyone's well-being over social conventions. Before ending their call, Alexander mentioned that he had been invited to speak at a business conference about innovative approaches to work-life balance, specifically focusing on how modern families could thrive when parents prioritized both professional fulfillment and collaborative child-rearing. Elena laughed, pointing out that they had accidentally become an example of something they had never intended to model. As Elena prepared for bed in her Florence hotel room, she felt a deep gratitude for the path their lives had taken. Their story hadn't ended with the fairy tale marriage they had once expected, but it had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more satisfying. A family built on honesty, flexibility, and the recognition that love could take many different forms, all of them valid when they served the people involved. 5 years had passed since Elena and Alexander's quiet parting, and the cherry trees in Hampstead were blooming once again as their family gathered to celebrate Charlotte's 13th birthday. The backyard of Elena's house was filled with laughter as teenagers played games while the adults watched from the terrace. Marveling at how quickly children grew and changed, Alexander arrived with James, now 9 and carrying a carefully wrapped present he had chosen himself for his sister. Elena watched from the kitchen window as Alexander greeted Charlotte with the special birthday hug that had become their tradition, lifting her off her feet despite her protests that she was too old for such displays of affection. At 13, Charlotte had developed into a thoughtful young woman who moved easily between her artistic mother's world and her business-minded father's sphere, comfortable in both without feeling torn between them. William, now 14, had grown tall and confident, showing the leadership qualities that made both his parents proud. He helped organize the party games with the natural authority of an older brother, making sure everyone felt included while keeping things running smoothly. His easy confidence came from growing up in a family where he had never felt responsible for his parents' happiness, where adult problems had been handled by adults, allowing him to simply be a child and then a teenager without carrying burdens that weren't his to bear. The success of Elena's Eastern European Fellowship had led to opportunities she could never have imagined. When she first made the difficult decision to leave her marriage, her book documenting emerging artists from former Soviet countries had won several international awards and was being translated into multiple languages. More importantly, the project had established her as a voice for underrepresented artists, leading to consulting work with major museums and art institutions across 3 continents. Alexander, too, had found ways to align his work more closely with his values. After Elena's fellowship year, he had restructured his company to focus on sustainable development projects, finding that he was much more engaged with business when it connected to causes he cared about. The change had required some financial adjustment, but the increased job satisfaction had improved every aspect of his life. Their co-parenting relationship had become so natural that they rarely needed to discuss logistics anymore. The children moved between homes according to their own activities and preferences, with both parents maintaining flexible schedules that prioritized family time. School friends were equally comfortable at either house, and teachers had long since stopped being confused by having two different addresses. For the same family, the most remarkable aspect of their arrangement was how it had influenced their extended family and friend groups. Elena's mother, who had initially been critical of their decision to divorce, now openly admired how well they had managed their separation and often pointed to their family as an example of putting children's needs first. Alexander's business colleagues frequently asked for advice about balancing career ambitions with family responsibilities, recognizing that his approach had allowed him to excel professionally while remaining deeply involved in his children's lives. As the birthday party continued into the evening, Elena found herself in conversation with Sarah, a friend whose marriage had been struggling for several years. Sarah confided that she and her husband were considering separation but were terrified of the impact on their children and uncertain about whether they could manage the practical complications. Elena listened carefully before sharing what she had learned from her own experience. She explained that divorce wasn't a failure if it allowed everyone in the family to thrive in ways they couldn't while trying to maintain an unsustainable situation. She emphasized that the success of their arrangement came from both she and Alexander putting their children's well-being above their own pride, social expectations, or fear of judgment. The hardest part wasn't the divorce itself, Elena explained to Sarah. It was learning to love each other in a completely different way. We had to let go of the story we thought our lives would follow and write a new one based on who we actually were rather than who we thought we should be. Later that evening, after the party guests had gone home and the children were settling into their bedrooms, Elena and Alexander sat on her back terrace, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about their children's futures. Charlotte was showing serious artistic talent and had been accepted into a prestigious summer art program. William was considering his options for secondary school, weighing academic opportunities against his growing interest in environmental science. James was simply enjoying being 9, though he had recently developed a fascination with astronomy that had both parents researching telescopes. As they talked, Elena realized how grateful she was for the path their lives had taken. Their story hadn't followed the traditional narrative arc of romance, marriage, and living happily ever after, but it had led to something more complex and ultimately more satisfying. A family built on honesty, mutual respect, and the recognition that love could evolve and take different forms while remaining strong. "Do you ever wonder what our friends think about us?" Alexander asked, gesturing toward the easy companionship they had developed over the years since their divorce. Elena considered the question. She knew that some people found their friendship confusing, unable to understand how two people could be so close while no longer being married. Others seemed to expect either animosity or reconciliation, as if those were the only two possible outcomes of an ended marriage. "I think they're starting to understand that there isn't just one way to be a family," Elena replied. "Our children are happy and secure. We're both fulfilled in our work and personal lives. We support each other through difficulties and celebrate each other's successes. If that's not a successful relationship, I don't know what is." Alexander nodded, raising his wine glass in a quiet toast. "To quiet partings that lead to better beginnings," he said. Elena smiled, touching her glass to his. As she looked out over her garden where their children were growing up secure and loved, she felt a deep satisfaction with the choices they had made. Their story had required courage to write, wisdom to navigate, and patience to see through to its current chapter. It was a story of love that had been strong enough to change form when necessary, of two people who had chosen honesty over comfort, and of a family that had thrived by refusing to be limited by conventional definitions. The cherry blossoms would bloom again next spring, as they had every year since Elena and Alexander's quiet parting. And their family would continue to grow and evolve, built on the foundation of love that had learned to express itself in the ways that served everyone best, proving that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that dare to rewrite their own endings.